Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Stephanie LeMenager. LeMenager is the Barbara and Carlisle Moor Professor of English at the U of O. Her interests include American Studies and Environmental Humanities. She's the co-founder of Resilience, an online environmental humanities journal. LeMenager's books include the co-edited collection Environmental Criticism for the 21st Century and the monograph Manifest and Other Destinies. Her latest book, Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century, was published in January 2014. Thanks, Stephanie, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Paul, for having me.
Can you give us your definition of environmental humanities?
The environmental humanities doesn't have a singular definition, which I think is a good thing. It's a set of methods, theoretical frames, memes borrowed from humanities research across fields and disciplines that comes into being as the environmental humanities when these theories and methodologies meet explicit projects. So, for instance, if someone is writing about drought and the cultures around water scarcity or food security, the sorts of artistic production, theoretical framing, ethnographic work that's done and brought together and assembled into a multidisciplinary project around such a topic becomes an environmental humanities project. So I always think of the environmental humanities as what Dick Hebdige has called thinking through making. We have to make it to think it. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of grab bag of interdisciplinary potentialities which don't necessarily coalesce into anything that is definite or definable. And in a way, we don't want to be too definable. We want to be flexible, dynamic, always on the move, always able to meet a new challenge.
So you've just launched the new online environmental humanities journal, Resilience. Tell us about that project, about the vision, what brought it about.
When I was at the University of Illinois for a seminar on sustainability studies, I was talking about my current project at the time, which was the project Living Oil, which is now a book. And I was saying how interesting it was that, here I am doing what supposedly we all want to do in the humanities, which is to come at a project from a lot of different directions, attempt to dabble in different disciplinary endeavors and methodologies. And yet, when I would send out an article from this, at the time, incipient project, I couldn't find a place where I really thought I could get a good review. In other words, a review that moved across humanities disciplines, the one that wasn't just coming from, say, eco-criticism, from people who study literature and environment. And Stephanie Foote, who's a professor at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, was in the audience of this particular panel, and she said, wouldn't it be great if there were a journal where this kind of reviewing happened? And we kind of looked at each other and we said, let's start this journal. And little did we know that across the globe, in New South Wales, Australia, another set of people were having similar ideas, and at the same moment, really, two environmental humanities journals were born. One is Resilience, which is now located in part in the University of Oregon, and the other one is called Environmental Humanities, and that's located in Australia, coming out of New South Wales.
Is the fact that it's an online journal significant?
Yeah, that was really part of our plan from the very beginning. We wanted to do two things with that. One, we wanted to say that in whatever way we're making an impact on this planet, we'd rather not at least get involved with the paper making industry. We just feel like that's such a big part of the publishing industry's carbon footprint. So much pollution is involved in the making of paper. We don't want that to be, wrapped up in our particular cultural endeavor. But we also wanted to use the online format for all of the different options that it offers us in terms of new media and hyperlinks and larger communities that can be born from, let's say, making an entire bibliography that's live linked. So we really liked that idea too. We liked the sort of social aspect and the expanded sociality that's involved in online work, in addition to trying to make a little bit less of an impact. We realized that we're still tied to the grid as everybody else is by avoiding paper. Yeah.
So your comment about humanities, environmental humanities, is defined by what the makers make.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds as if you understand resilience as a forum where new cultural forms, new environmental cultural forms could potentially be created and disseminated.
Yeah, I do. I mean, one thing that we're doing right now that's very interesting is, well, I guess I'll say two things. First, our very first issue, which just launched, is an issue in which we have about 25 major scholars from across the humanities fields and humanistic social sciences like cultural geography offering very brief manifestos about what we think resilience is. And resilience has a very complicated history. It's been tied in part to neoliberal development programs, things that we don't support at all. But like Stuart Hall, we want to take back the charismatic words, and we want to do that with the sort of most interesting creative intelligences in the various fields of the humanities who are working on the environment. So we had this whole idea of doing a kind of round of manifestos interspersed with interviews that have live links to various bibliographic sources and images. That kind of formatting is not entirely, of course, new in the journal or magazine world, but it's one that's a little bit out of the box for an academic journal. There's a whole section, a media section in the journal's first issue that is primarily visual in its orientation. So people are experiencing visual essays, visual argumentation, rather than merely the sort of textual arguments that we typically see in an academic article. So our first issue was already trying to push some of the boundaries of an academic journal, but what we're doing now with, in concert with Joni Adamson actually at ASU, is having people in an environmental humanities workshop at ASU write down the process of thinking through the creation of some new media objects and new media platforms that we're collaboratively putting together. And the prototyping of those projects is going to be recorded and documented in an issue of Resilience. So we're interested in all kinds of forms, including incomplete and unfinished ones, which can sometimes be the most productive of, I think, new thought.
Interesting. A couple of years ago, speaking of manifestos, you and Stephanie Foote, you're the co-founder of Resilience, published something of a manifesto in PMLA, the journal of the Professional Organization of Literary Scholars and Teachers, entitled The Sustainable Humanities. What are the sustainable humanities?
The humanities have always been sustainable. One of the things that we argue is we're such a low-cost operation, and we're an operation that's so much about thinking through how values can have continuity in the culture, how they can be productive of ecological health and social health and community. The sort of ethical impetus of the humanities is part of its project from the very beginning, and I think that's in one way why it is somewhat of a threatening field set for those who tend to hold the money and the power in university structures. This is not a field that's irrelevant to contemporary problems. It's the field that actually should be probably most potently and centrally in dialogue with scientists and technology folks and people making policy. And we always have had those conversations. I think we're now kind of giving ourselves these qualifying labels like environmental humanities or medical humanities in order to simply highlight the fact that we're already in the mix here, we're already in conversation. And I would say the other piece of the environmental humanities that is a sort of statement I could make about the humanities more broadly and that has to do with sustainability is the imagining of possible worlds that comes about through humanistic work, particularly work in literary studies, for instance, is all about imagining worlds that are both present and non-present at the same time, allowing for kind of spaces of speculative growth, affirmative speculation, rather than the kind of speculation that simply fixes the future for us, sort of indemnifies against it. So we're in the futures business, but in a really productive way, not dealing in derivatives, dealing in imagination and innovation. And that's always been the case. And I think one way to show that is not only to link up with natural scientists and around issues like the environment, but also to really continue to productively collaborate with artists and makers of culture.
You've just answered a question I was going to ask about public humanities. You've just given a very cogent and powerful defense of public humanities. I also know you to be a dedicated and thoughtful teacher. How does your vision of sustainable humanities, environmental humanities, public humanities inform your work in the classroom?
Well, I thank you, Paul, because I know you're also an award-winning teacher, so I appreciate that compliment very much. To me, the most vital aspect of my work as an academic has always been my teaching. When I discovered that I loved teaching, I told one of my mentors at Harvard, where I went to graduate school, and he said, well, that's a very good thing, because many people don't. But what's vital for me around teaching is that these are the public fora in which I not only test my own ideas, but in which I learn what it means to practice something like embodied citizenship. And when I use the word citizenship, I use it with a certain amount of anxiety, I guess, because I'm certainly not talking about the formal sort of apparatus of citizenship that can be very exclusive at times, but I'm talking about civic engagement, engaging in community building, in the sort of foundations of democratic process. I see that all the time in literature classrooms. These are spaces that can't be privatized. These are spaces like what we once thought of, I think, before social media as the street. Anything can be said in these classrooms. Anything can be thought. There's a tremendous amount of freedom of voice and imagination as well. And so when I think about futures, when I think about innovation, when I think about entrepreneurial possibility, I really think about what we do in the classroom as we think with our students about the possibilities and potentialities of art, literary art, visual art, film, these various media that allow us to, again, enter possible worlds and think through in very explicit ways how the future might go, how it might be, or how we might act against what seems inevitability, because nothing is inevitable. And I think sometimes our students forget this. It's a kind of hard cultural moment to remember that we have such agency.
They're lucky to have someone like you in the classroom to help them not forget that. I'd like to ask you some questions about the new book.
Sure.
Can you first gloss for us the title, Living Oil?
Right. When I first went into an oil museum in Southeast Texas, where my own family actually has been involved in the oil industry, the first thing that I saw was a display of all the different products that are derived from petroleum. And I had thought some about this. You know, the reason I was in the museum was because I had researched a book project, but I hadn't realized that most of the things that surround my own physical person, even aspirin tablets that I ingest, all of my modern accoutrement really are petroleum derived. My very body is saturated with oil. And so living oil is about really living as a modern, which is living deeply, deeply, deeply in the fossil fuel complex. And not necessarily being aware of it, but at the same time breathing it, experiencing as a second skin, again, a form of embodiment, really.
What led you to this project?
It was very personal. The project, you know, it dates back to my own family history. As I said in the prologue of the book, my father was kind of saved, if we consider entering the middle class to be saved, by a small investment in an oil property. And when he was a young man, he was essentially orphaned. And you know, there's a lot of stories like this. Rick Bass has written about this too, where we think about oil and we typically think of tycoons and corporations and sort of the greediest and most powerful entities on earth. But in the mid-20th century, there were many sort of regular people, middle-class aspirants who entered what seemed like one of the most progressive times in American history through energy, through the fossil fuel complex, again, in one way or the other. So I was very interested in how some of the great beauties of the 20th century, including that mass middle class that we could claim for a while, no longer, but for a while, including public education, including progressive movements like feminism and environmentalism even, how all of these movements to some degree and these possibilities had as a sort of fundamental assumption, often unquestioned, the access to cheap energy. How were the great sort of products of modernity, cultural products, related to that? So that personal question came from my own family, but also from sort of thinking through the 20th century with my father. And then I would go one step further and say I was living, as I discovered a few years ago, in the middle of a frack zone in California. And that created a whole different perspective on the potentialities, cultural and otherwise, of oil. So.
In the book, you study a variety of documents of what you call petroleum culture.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that term, petroleum culture?
Well, petroleum culture, or petroculture, in its most explicit form, these are cultural artifacts, such as print books, for instance. My own book I had analyzed by a policy analyst to see exactly how much petroleum was involved in its production. These are cultural artifacts that are derived in some sense from petroleum. You can take that very broadly. I mean, we can talk about the publishing industry, the film industry, and its debts, both those industries' debts to petroleum and to fossil fuels, and there's been a lot of work done on that recently. But you can also look at it more broadly. Almost every aspect of the American-built landscape, one could say, is a kind of symptom of petroleum culture. The freeways and suburban complexes that so completely define and typify what it means to be a contemporary American, whether they are box stores that we now have renovated into churches, or box stores that are still very much thriving with various discount outlets, et cetera. These are our new sort of temples, our new community centers. They're the sacred spaces of this nation, which are also, again, deeply indebted, culturally speaking, to petroleum. So petroculture is pretty ubiquitous.
So tell us about this archive that you draw on in the text. What's in this archive? You just said petroculture is everything.
Yeah, it's everything, and the big problem for me as a writer was, how do you write about everything? You know,
it's a big problem.
you know, you got to do something to refine that thesis. So what I decided to do was just pick a series of artifacts that I found representative of certain cultural moments. I looked at a lot of the work that was done around the BP blowout, and prior to that, Hurricane Katrina, which I see also was quite related to our oil culture and the way that it has developed infrastructure in the U.S. in certain respects. So I took a look at poetry, at some performance, at some videography around those issues on the Gulf Coast, and kind of traced a genealogy back to the early work that was done in environmental justice coming out of Houston. That was one aspect that I really wanted to interrogate. I also took oil museums as an archive that seemed to me to be very much about projecting from an imagined past an equally potently imagined future. So I went to Canada, looked at an award-winning museum, their science museum, that treats the tar sands development. It's a brilliant museum. It forecasts a future that, to me, is absolutely terrifying, but it does so with a lot of high aesthetic value, and therefore it was a very interesting object, so to speak, to look at. I looked at architectural modeling, both in literature and in architectural theory, from the 1950s and 60s at the height of the suburban complex in one chapter. To me, that seemed like a kind of key watershed moment for petroleum culture as an exemplum of our kind of most profound ingenuity as American moderns. And then I began the book with something that, again, was a bit more personal to me, which was the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969. At the time I wrote the book, I was living in Santa Barbara, and I thought the whole question of kind of spilling out of what was the gold standard of American suburban living at the time of that event, notably Southern California suburbs, spilling out of that into what was a traumatic ecological tragedy, really, for many people in the area, was worth considering what happens when sort of the petroleum complex splits and we see something that doesn't make sense, that doesn't really form part of that progressive trajectory of modernity. And then, equally important, why is it so easy to forget those spill events and to keep living in a status quo that's maybe a little bit too comfortable?
Why do you think it's so easy to forget?
I think it's so easy to forget because the very underpinnings of everything that is considered to be most modern, most progressive, most interesting about this culture, meaning North American culture, are tangled up in oil. This is also why climate change as a global phenomenon is very, very difficult for many extremely educated people to act upon, or act within, yes, or against.
One of your chapters is called Petro Melancholia.
Yeah.
What is that? What is that?
Well, that's the sort of unresolved grieving for that moment in petroleum culture when the oil was easy to get, when it was cheap, when it didn't require fracking or ultra-deep ocean drilling and those kinds of extremely dangerous methods we associate with tough oil. It's a grief for that moment when the question of energy wasn't quite so vexed, and a grief that persists rather unproductively. I think melancholy can be productive, but in this case it's unproductive because it means that rather than really pushing to move into different energy complexes and systems, we're allowing ourselves to embrace, and I say we, meaning not so much myself personally, but myself as part of the larger culture, we're allowing ourselves to embrace what's been called the shale revolution or the tough oil, the era of tough oil, an era that has very different both economic and ecological costs attached to it than those earlier moments up to the mid-20th century of oil production and use.
You've used the term tough oil, and you also talk a lot in the book about peak oil.
Mm-hmm.
What is peak oil?
Well, peak oil goes to the whole concept of Hubbard's peak and the idea forecast many times actually, but most prominently from the mid-20th century, that we would reach peak oil production first in the US and then globally at a certain moment around maybe 2010 or a little bit before or a little bit after. And at that point in time, oil resources would be depleted to the extent that serious social consequences could occur, and new energy regimes would have to be imagined into being speedily with the utmost kind of precision and efficiency and ingenuity of design. So peak oil, I think, has been a real catalyst for rethinking energy systems. I think it's a movement that has a kind of wonderful traction. Unfortunately, from my point of view, the oil companies kind of trumped it with tough oil and other forms of ingenuity and ingenious extractive methods, which, to my mind, are ultimately going to be a much more short-lived phenomenon than they're being predicted to be.
Well, we know that these resources are not unending.
Right.
There will be a post-peak oil future.
Yes.
It's coming.
Yes.
How do you think we'll meet that? Do you, I mean, obviously it's purely speculative. Are you hopeful about that time and our ability to adapt to it?
I think that time could be a little bit farther away than we thought in even 2008, when T. Boone Pickens was involved in investing in wind power and really making a point about the need for a new energy regime. So the time is a little bit farther away than actually, in some sense, is convenient for a person who wants to see those changes implemented. My concern is that I think we are looking, as Michael T. Clare suggested, at a future of resource scarcity in which more and more resource war is on the horizon, in which those who are most disadvantaged, primarily in the global south, will feel the hardest hits of this resource scarcity and will be also most exploited in terms of their own particular resource reserves. I don't see a lot of action on the horizon except in small pockets. I mean, Germany, for instance, has done a lot to push over into renewables. And of all the European nations, all the nations in the global north, it seems to provide one potential example of policy working in harmony with ecological limits and potentialities. On the other hand, as a recent science writer has pointed out, Germany has just started purchasing more coal. So, there are ways in which even the most progressive policies tend to get mixed up in questions of economy, what's the cheapest resource, how do we balance the kinds of investments we're making, et cetera. So it seems to me as if it's a very open future in ways that are both somewhat interesting and really terrifying.
We have about a minute and a half left. Could you tell us a little about your next project?
Well, my next project is actually tentatively, I don't know if I want to give the title of it. I'm calling it Weathering at the moment, but it's really about what literature does ecologically speaking. There's been a lot of work around the sociology of literature. Recently, some interesting work done by a young scholar named Matthew Schneider-Meyerson on peak oil, actually, and how literary accounts of peak oil and of climate change and potential dystopian futures encourage the subculture of peak oil enthusiasts. He's actually done a series of surveys around that and seen some direct correlations that are surprising and interesting. I'm not so much interested in that kind of sociological work, but I am really quite interested in thinking through the ways that story and narrative form make possible and have made possible human survival, and putting that in a contemporary context in which certain questions like food scarcity and food security, drought, global climate change, and of course, the problem of modern energy are salient.
Best of luck with that project. Thank you so much for describing that one to us, as well as the recent book, your work on the journal, your work as an environmental humanist and as a sustainable humanist.
Thank you,
It's been
Paul.
a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too.
I've been speaking with Stephanie LeMenager, the Barbara and Carlisle Moor Professor of English at the University of Oregon. She is the co-founder of the Environmental Humanities journal Resilience and author of Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century. Thanks so much for watching.